The Square Ball Podcast.
Hello there and welcome to the show. Dan here with Michael from The Square Ball and Phil Hay from The Athletic for our regular end-of-week catch-up, which we've delayed slightly as well, just because we had the Angus Kinnear interview that went out. We're going to get onto that in a minute. First thing to say is that the show is brought to you by... What's that, Michael? Have you got very clean hands there?
Yep.
What's that? Why are you wearing a hoodie? If you're by the way, if you're listening to the audio version, have a look on YouTube. It's on there as well. Michael is wearing an Astonish hoodie on one of the warmest days of the year.
Oh, I'm glad to be wearing it. It's definitely not for this, just for this read. I've got the big three, Anna. Got the big three in front of me.
What are they?
Protect and Care antibacterial hand wash, extra strength grease lifter,
Yeah.
and of course my personal favourite, the mold and mildew blast.
What flavour is that? Apple Blast.
Apple.
Very, very good. Astonish manufacture ethical household and personal care cleaning products. Where do they make them?
Yorkshire.
Exactly. Born and bred in Leeds, award-winning value products include the UK's #1 mould and mildew blaster. Show it to the camera. There it is. The deep cleaning and safe-to-touch oven and grill cleaning paste. We haven't got that to hand because it's not part of the big three today. Might be another day.
Yeah.
Yeah. But there's no harsh chemicals, no corrosives. Officially certified cruelty-free and vegan as well. Astonish.co.uk for details.
I'm going to take my hoodie off now because, as you said, it's 26 degrees outside.
I think that hoodie needs a courtesy wash, don't you? He's been in here for about 9 months.
A courtesy wash for himself, probably.
It's like my kickboxing towel. I use it twice a week. I haven't washed it in 2 years.
Phil.
That's absolutely outrageous.
You must be riddled with fungus.
No, it's all right. It survives every week. I don't know what the other people make of it, but from my point of view, it's fine.
Smell like a shin pad.
Well, then, yeah, we spoke to Angus Kinnear, so we have a little debrief on that because it's one of the big talking points at the minute.
Big debrief.
And
really.
you did you somehow. I mean, we were obviously coordinating on that, and you were going to run the transcript, and then I sent you the transcript because you can generate them with computers these days. And
you were too lazy to write out.
Well, you see, back in the day, I would have sat and typed that word for word from start to finish. And it's only really in the last couple of years that you've been able to use
AI
software to do it for you. And I have to say, the second transcript you sent me through was absolutely word perfect, which was pretty incredible. But yeah, the original
I was
plan
going to say, we scrolled down to the bottom, it was 24,500 words.
Yeah, the original plan had been to do a full Q&A, questions, answers from top to bottom, and then you sent it through and it was 25,000 words. We were kind of thinking of a limit of 3 or 4, so it needed some chopping, definitely. It was a terrific interview. I thought you guys did a great job with him. Covered a hell of a lot of ground through it. I mean, he was here for nigh on 2 hours, and there probably was that much to get into. I think the club would like to, certainly now that transfer window's closed, to draw a line between what went before and what's going to happen now, as if to say, that was then and this is what went wrong. This is how it's going to be from this point forward. And there are things that have happened over the summer that make it easier to do that. Change of ownership, change of head coach, change of division, certainly, but the shift of players in and out as well. There is a different picture at the club. There's a different set of faces. There are some constants, of which Angus Kinnear is obviously one. He was Radrazani's chief executive. He's also now the 49ers CEO, and you did ask him about his position and the scrutiny that is on it or should be on it. But I thought the biggest takeaway from the interview, I thought as a whole, it kind of depicted the regime that is gone as one that was in the end out of its depth in the Premier League and not fit for purpose and trying but failing to punch above its weight. If you go through all the different issues that you got into, and there were lots from players to coaching staff and everything else, Kinnear was pretty much admitting recruitment wrong, the hiring of head coaches after Bielsa wrong, the level of funding that Radrazani had in the Premier League wrong as well. I think you have to be careful how you frame that, because it's possible to have what we would regard as insane levels of wealth and for that to be virtually worthless in the Premier League. I mean,
I'd like to be as poor as Andre Radrazani.
Exactly that. And if you were given £100 million in cash tomorrow, it wouldn't take you very far when it came to Premier League ownership.
I mean, I'd never see you two again.
No, you certainly...
I'd be just drinking myself to death in the sun.
You certainly wouldn't. Although you would find that if you went into football club ownership, you lost the money in an instant, and then you'd be back here begging Michael for your job back and trying to bin Moscow out of the presenter's seat. But you wouldn't, give or take, you wouldn't be able to buy a club. In most instances, you wouldn't be able to buy a majority share of a Premier League club. You've got a lot of money coming in, but you would have to spend it on players, transfers and wages, otherwise you get relegated. Even if you do spend it, you might get relegated anyway, and you end up in the Championship where clubs just are resigned to making massive losses. So your money just completely disappears. So I think Kinnear said at one point, you can't really criticise somebody for not being rich enough. And I think in a financial sense, that's true, and that's probably fair. But also, the timing of the takeover, wrong. Kinnear said more than once in that, had the 49ers bought a year ago, had they bought previously, this might have been different. There were opportunities for that to happen had everybody on all sides been willing to do it. I think, would you in the end call it systemic failure? I think you probably would. And
I think I called it that from a while back, to be honest. Like that, I think it always felt like, and it's exactly the stuff that Angus Kinnear was getting at when it came to the Bielsa era and why ultimately that failed. And everything ends up failing in one capacity or another in football, doesn't it, in the end, sadly. But it always felt to me like we never quite had the wealth to do what he wanted, or there wasn't the infrastructure there behind it at the club, or whatever it might be. It felt eventually like it was going to fail.
Dysfunctional, I would say, and basing this on Kinnear's own comments, dysfunctional in a way where the consequences were going to be inevitable, you would probably say.
I think the frustration on the transfers and not having enough money is that we did have the summer of selling Rafinha and Phillips for record fees, and there was the potential there, as you see at Brighton. Like if you look at Brighton's net spend this summer is like minus 110 million or something because of all the players they've sold. But they'll still have a good season. There are ways of selling players and bringing players in and getting a conveyor belt going of people coming through.
And he conceded that, didn't he, as well?
But our first real attempt at doing it, we didn't get any hits on it. They were basically all failed. And it's not like we didn't spend money because...
Well, we spent a lot, didn't we, really?
I know the fees of sort of 10 to 25 million pounds, which is the sort of ballpark we were in for most of them. I know they're not big fees, but you can expect a half-decent footballer for that normally, and I don't feel we got any.
There was a piece on The Athletic last week or the week before which was talking about the way in which fees have gone up and saying that Premier League clubs now, when they inquire about somebody, expect to be quoted off the bat, irrespective of who it is. 20 million, 25 million pound fee for that player, because that has become kind of standard price. And there was quite a lot of merriment in our office at Rob Holding moving from Arsenal for 4 million quid. You just thought, does anybody even get out of bed for that kind of money anymore? And clearly they do in rare cases, but I think it is the case that you no longer think of 10, 50 million pounds in the Premier League, players of that level being a thing. Everybody does spend more. And it's possibly true that Radrizzani came into this and into the Premier League at perhaps the worst time if you're not dealing in billions. If you don't have billions to deal in and you only have millions, it is getting harder and harder and harder. You're definitely right about the recruitment. I just thought there was a kind of underlying tone of an attempt to game the system, accepting what was said about the possibility that among a group of, I think he said 12 clubs, Kinnear, and that's probably about right, possibly 14, but 12 certainly. It doesn't take much in any season for any of them to get into trouble and to go down. Some are better placed than others. Some are more sensible in what they do than others. But it's quite an even field. And if you take Everton surviving last season, in no way through design, in the end, through luck and through chance of getting away with it on the final day of the season. But minus, I guess, the money that they needed to a certain level, they were trying to get hits, like you say, with players who Kinnear described as in the end being 5 out of 10s, but who they thought could be exceptional on the day, but actually the kind of baseline level that they were playing at wasn't high enough to keep them up. Trying to an extent to game the system by going for somebody like Marsh, who, just wasn't suitable, wasn't right, didn't work, looks now like a punt and a gamble, which... it was really when there were out there far more, I guess, far safer bets on the coaching front when you're replacing Bielsa. I think in all of what's happened, that will probably be the biggest regret for the club, is what they did after Bielsa, however much the relationship with Bielsa had broken down, and however much they felt that the change needed to be made. In order for them to justify doing it, the change had to be right. And it wasn't on the basis that they've been relegated. And Kinnear said himself, the timing of sacking Marsh, with hindsight now, you remember the conversation we had after the Leicester game away. And you said to me, do you think there's any way back from this? And I said, no, I don't.
I was slightly surprised at that, by the way. I didn't think you'd call it that early.
It was so extreme on the night. And it sort of been building, and there'd been this scepticism anyway, that it just didn't feel right, didn't feel good, didn't feel like it was going in a good direction. And, Kinnear's admission was, it's clearly a mistake. We should have done it around about the time of the Liverpool and Bournemouth games, because the World Cup break was coming up. That would have given us more scope. Would it have made a total difference? Would it have kept them up? It's really difficult to say, because the squad didn't perform. But it might have changed the players they went after in January. It might have just made them, more pragmatic in a way that actually worked.
Well, what we do know is that the path that they followed led to relegation, so we know that the alternative was probably better.
Well, it would have been worth a go, and I think in the same way as had they gone down under Marsh away at Brentford on the last day of the 21-22 season, then there would have been that part of you thinking, well, they might as well just have stuck with Bielsa.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of the things we have to acknowledge is that Kinnear has personal and professional relationships to maintain as well, and that dictated the tone of what was said on the show as well. So, for example, his work, and I mentioned it to him in the show, that he worked closely with Victor Orta. So they've obviously got a relationship there. So people expecting him to completely throw Victor Orta under the bus over the recruitment, it probably just wasn't going to happen, was it?
No, I don't think so. And he got into that towards the end when you were asking him about the programme notes. And he said, I'm chief executive of the club, so if you expect me to come out and slate Bamford or Firpo in the programme notes, it's not going to happen. Whatever people's personal view on that, or what's been said behind the scenes, you do have to present some sort of company club image, in the same way as you have to in an interview like that. I do think it's far better to be seen to face up and front up to questions like that than it is to just hide away. Clubs generally like people to engage with them and to listen to them and to promote their message when things are going swimmingly, and when they've got things to sell or things to promote or things that they want credit for. But the reality is that supporters, your average fan base, want answers to things that go wrong as well. And I think Kinnear, having sat with you for 2 hours, it becomes difficult after that stage to expect him to continue speaking about this stuff relentlessly. His answers are his answers. You either take them or you don't. But that's his point of view, and he's been pressed on a lot of it. If you say nothing, I think it does great with a fan base who say, it's all well and good promoting this image of the club when it's great and things look grand from the outside. But you do have to show that when things go wrong, that you're willing to talk about that as well. You're willing to explain what's gone wrong. And I do fear that over time, and it's happening a little bit, but as time goes on, clubs are going to become so big and so consumed by money at such a high level of finance, that they will become completely detached and they won't feel the need to specifically answer for anything. But I don't think Leeds are at that level. And I also think in this city and with this fan base, there's an expectation that you're acknowledged and that they do pay attention to what you think. So whether or not people like the answers that were given or what was in the content of the interview, I think it's a good thing that the interview happened, because I do think that hiding away from this and just saying, well, that was then and we're moving on, isn't a good look.
Yeah.
I feel like the idea that the fans were being ignored as well comes from the end of last season as well, where to contrast to staying up at Brentford, you had Orta on the pitch, you had Radrizzani on the pitch, you had Orta kind of central to things. He's ragging Jesse Marsh around, pointing at him, to the end of last season where Orta's gone, Radrizzani's in Italy trying to buy another club, and the feeling was like, well, there's no one here anymore. There's no one running this place. I
think the takeover was a factor in that as well, and again, it's all the nuance, isn't it? And I guess that was the thing about the interview, was he started to get a bit of nuance behind the issues, as opposed to just kind of pitchforks at the ready. But takeovers are predominantly confidential processes, so it's not as if everybody can update on on what's going on all the time. And it's quite telling, I think, that the EFL have introduced new rules now, which mean that you cannot announce a takeover in principle. So
Special Leeds rules.
Leeds did that, and I don't think the EFL were very happy about it, although I don't think Leeds came a cropper because I don't think the rules were in place quite at that point, but they certainly are now. But the reason that it was done, and the reason that the club put out that really, really brief holding statement, which just said literally, Radrizzani and the 49ers have agreed this deal. It will now need EFL approval, the end, basically. There were no sort of bells and whistles on it at all. The reason they did it was because there had been total silence from the club for nigh on 4 or 5 weeks after getting relegated. And the reason for that was because it's all going on in the background. That's fine, and that's legitimate in a lot of respects, and it's hard for it to be any different. But it doesn't change the fact that you have a big fan base who you want to come to games and buy tickets and buy merchandise, buy the new kit, who are sitting saying, what has gone on? What is going on? Answer some questions.
It was important to take ownership of it, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Even if you come in and saying the obvious thing, we got it wrong, I accept responsibility for it. Sometimes people just need to hear it and go through that process.
Some people won't like it. Some people will still be sitting saying, I don't accept this, I don't accept that. Some people will still be questioning Kinnear's job. You did. He said, probably actually, one of the most interesting lines from it was him saying, I don't think relegation has to be terminal in terms of a CEO's future or a CEO's position. Again, that's probably a valid point of view, although the counterpoint might be, well, perhaps that could have applied to Bielsa as well. I do accept that head coach's job and CEO's job are totally different and totally different requirements. I do accept that the relationship between the club and Bielsa was not brilliant at the point where he went, and there was some pretty severe doubt about whether he would want a contract extension, whether he would be offered a contract extension at the end of the season. It was all a little bit of a mess. But you have seen other clubs who've been relegated and bounced back. I think there comes a point, doesn't it, where there's only so much failure you can be associated with. And I think even though, to use Orta as an example, even though Orta and the club parted company by what you'd call mutual consent, he wasn't sacked. But he wanted Gracia to stay in the job after the Bournemouth defeat. The board didn't. Kinnear was suggesting Allardyce as an option, somebody he could get. Orta wasn't having that, so it was agreed that they would go their separate ways. Even if that hadn't happened, I think it would have been incredibly difficult for Orta to have stayed on as director of football this summer, because too much water under the bridge, too much of a frustration, and sometimes it becomes far too much of a diversion or a distraction for a club who really do need to settle down.
Do you think with Orta, because this is kind of a nagging suspicion I've had, is that maybe he felt in some ways, for as much as Bielsa did, in some ways, he felt we'd maybe reached a point where Bielsa was holding us back because he was maybe saying no to signings that he thought, no, because if we can get this player in, and if we can just find someone who's willing to work with this, maybe it can move us on and we can churn more players through and we can buy a lower level of player. Because Kinnear was basically saying yesterday, Bielsa was only asking for like £40 million footballers, and then in the end he was saying, okay, fine, I'll just keep Tyler Roberts if we can't get that. Do you think there was a frustration with that, and maybe the club thought they could do it without Bielsa, and it was completely naive to think that?
I think it had reached the point where they weren't able to function properly together. It had almost become a collision of reality versus what was really needed, in that the club didn't have enough money to serve up the sort of players who would have allowed Bielsa to take, properly push Leeds beyond the level they were at. Again, I suppose you have to debate whether or not that is something you'd criticise the club for, in as much as the money you've got is the money you've got. Yeah, so if you have a fortune behind you, then you can move into the higher bracket of signings. I never got the feeling through the Premier League years that Leeds were in a position to move into that bracket of signing. Perhaps they would have been had the 49ers had the funding behind them, which they say they have and appear to have. And I think a lot of us felt, and certainly feel with hindsight, that the summer of 2021 felt like the point at which, if fresh money had come in a big way, it could have made a really big difference. And the point that Kinnear was speaking about, Bielsa and Radrizzani saying it's, you need to replace me as coach or you need to replace the entire squad. Radrizzani said that to us when we interviewed him at the beginning of last summer. And he said, the two of them had spoken about it, but it had kind of been accepted that they didn't want to lose Bielsa, but they weren't able to deliver, a stack of 30, 40 million pound players. They just didn't have the cash. I think they definitely thought at the point where they sacked Bielsa that bringing somebody else in, things being a bit more pragmatic, a change away from man-to-man, everything else, if they could stay up, and if Marsh was as good as they thought he was, then it could lead to a more stable period and a period that kind of retained Premier League status. But the results speak for themselves, and it did not work.
Yeah, but what it boiled down to was that the manager wasn't good enough and the recruitment wasn't good enough, because Kinnear himself acknowledged that, didn't he? He said, you can afford to get maybe one of them wrong, but he also knows that if you get one wrong in a Premier League season, you leave yourself open to relegation. And Leeds got both wrong.
Yeah, and even if you get one wrong, you still have to redeem that. So Villa, for example, with Emery, that's the sort of decision where if it really works, it cures everything. But, there are other scenarios where Everton, for example, Lampard goes, Dyche comes in, they get away with it by the skin of their teeth, but it's not looking great for them again this season, because it's not that easy to solve midway through the season. And it certainly isn't that easy to solve when so many of the players you've signed are just not performing and not looking like decent level Premier League footballers, even if they are.
Emery was one of the points I wish we'd gone back on, actually, because Kinnear said that he was too expensive for them at the time. They essentially said, he's a good manager, Villa have done well to get him, but we couldn't afford him. But it's almost to probe, what couldn't we afford? Couldn't we afford his wages? Couldn't we afford the transfer budget he wanted? Because obviously he made a big thing of saying, we were paying Bielsa an absolute fortune in the Championship. So obviously at points we were willing to stick a huge amount of money into a manager, but then at that point, clearly not.
One of Emery's first games was, and I don't think it was his very first, was against Leeds at Villa Park. And if you look back at the coverage we did of Marsh's sacking, and around about that time, we were saying that the Villa game, weirdly enough, as with Bielsa the previous season, it had been Villa Park where there had suddenly been this groundswell, certainly within Radrizzani, but, and the board in general, that this might not be good and we might need to change this. The Villa game was the weekend, even though Leeds played well there, really unlucky to lose to Villa, but they did lose. There was a big suggestion over that weekend that Radrizzani was going to sack Marsh. There was a big suggestion that if he did, Victor Orta was going to resign because he still believed that Marsh that Marsh could do the job and would keep them up. And you'll notice in the transcript with Kinnear, there is the line where he says, and you asked him about, when Marsh could have been sacked, and I think he was talking more about the Bournemouth-Liverpool period, but he said there wasn't alignment on the board about this. There was not a kind of unanimous agreement. I don't know if you thought he was saying differently, but I thought that's what he said. And that was the case around about the Villa defeat as well, was that Radrizzani, to my mind, wanted a change. There were other people, and I can't position who was where exactly, but there wasn't widespread agreement that yes, at that point we definitely need a shift. So whether or not they could have afforded Emery, I think is a little bit of a red herring, because I don't think at the point where Emery was available, they were genuinely mobilising to, or not en masse, to replace Marsh. So by the time Marsh went, he'd gone as an option anyway.
And as a follow-on from that, just returning to the post-Bournemouth game, we've seen a repeat of that behaviour, haven't we? That Orta wasn't willing to let Gracia go. And then that brings you back to this idea of a point of failure that I raised with Kinnear, that ultimately Orta's got so much sway, and you wonder if maybe did he have that much sway because of the success of Bielsa, that he was able to wield more power within that dynamic, and had a lot of say over subsequent managers, and maybe at that point, because he's doubled down on Marsh, he's doubled down on Gracia, that it brings a lot of attention back to him, doesn't it? And his failings ultimately.
I think what I've seen at Leeds has convinced me more and more that there is definitely a place at a club for a sporting director of football with an awful lot of authority. And it wouldn't surprise me that much if at some point down the line, Leeds, despite the fact that at the moment they've got this setup of Nick Hammond and Greta Steinson. Hammond, I think, must be out of contract or thereabouts now, but Leeds would really like to keep him. It'd be interesting to see where that goes. I think they like what he's done through the summer. They like the way he operates and the way he works, and he's very experienced. So you might well see him stay on if he's willing. But it wouldn't surprise me that much if they do at some stage employ an overarching director of football, sporting director, whatever the title is, who goes above them. What you have these positions and these people at a lot of major clubs too. But the more I look at it, the more I sort of realise that you also have managers with massive amounts of authority too. That was true of Bielsa, and it worked for a long period under Bielsa. I also think, for what it's worth, it's far more true of Farke than it is for anybody who's gone before him. Allardyce, I think, is the sort of guy who you can't really tell to do X, Y, and Z. But the Allardyce period is just worth disregarding completely, because, as Kinnear said, there was no science to that. It was just a case of, can this guy motivate the players through 4 games and somehow get us out of this hole? No, he can't. But Farke, we said, a few weeks back, that the demand for the title of manager over head coach is kind of semantics. And I think Kinnear used that word in the interview, but it's pretty significant, because I think what Farke was saying was, I'm in charge here. When it comes to the first team, I am in charge. I'm not going to be told who to play. I'm not going to be told who to sign. And it was, the comment of Daniel does not report to a director of football, I think summed it up really. You've almost gone back to something closer to the Bielsa era, in that this, and I know from some things that have gone on this summer, that he can be very ruthless in a good way when he needs to be. He's very much in control, very much in his head. This is my kind of fiefdom to run, in a positive sense. I think it's a really good appointment. How quickly it works, or whether it works, will determine how good it really is. But I sort of feel that with a manager with the authority of Bielsa, a very, a sporting director of football with a lot of authority can work. But I think Leeds, my personal view is that Leeds might have suffered from the fact that post Bielsa, the head coach, manager seemed to have less and less power, less and less influence, less demanding.
Do you think that goes back almost to a time when Orta first arrived, and I suppose we were coming off the back of Monk and into Christensen, and Christensen in some ways feels like almost a mirror image of the Marsh appointment, in that he was someone plucked slightly from obscurity, certainly not a name that any fans would have been asking for, and then had a load of players pushed in his direction. And I know in the case of Marsh there were a load of Red Bull players there, so there were people who would have wanted to a degree, but it felt like it was almost a transition from Orta pulling the strings to then there's a middle bit where Bielsa's doing it, then it goes back to Orta, and now we're back to Farke, and the bits where Orta was doing the football stuff, it basically was a disaster.
I think that's certainly true the first season. Christensen, to my knowledge, seemed to take very little interest at all in signings. Not that he didn't want good players, not that he didn't look at who was coming in and so on, but he wasn't the sort of coach who went around shouting the odds or dropping lists on desks and saying, I've got to have these players. They were being put to him and he was kind of saying, yeah, no, that'll be fine. And it didn't work out. And when I was saying earlier about gaming the system, I think Christensen falls into that quite a bit. The idea that we're going for this fairly obscure coach who, okay, had, certain level of success out in Cyprus, but was not well known at all, was not in any way proven as a championship coach. Didn't work. I mean, it started really well, oddly, but, didn't work and clearly had to be changed. And a little bit like that with Heckingbottom as well, although the thing about Heckingbottom at the time, and nobody wanted to really hear this, but he was regarded as a good coach, like good, talented, capable coach, and he has won promotion with Sheffield United, and he has done good things there. It just wasn't a great fit at a time where the squad was nowhere near what it needed to be to get promoted, without the kind of attention and, I guess, talented coaching nous that Bielsa ploughed into, and made this amazing team out of what looked like a mid-table squad. It just wasn't the right fit. And as I say, I think there would have had to have been, perhaps 49ers would have thought differently. They didn't think poorly of him particularly. And they do like Kinnear, which is why he's still in place. But I think the 49ers would have had to seriously consider that position this summer, because it had become toxic.
I think, talking about that approach, and you raised it, Michael, actually, with Angus Kinnear, saying that with the exception of Bielsa, it's felt like before and after there are some obvious things that have been consistent throughout in terms of management and recruitment and stuff like that. Felt a little bit like we've gone into the mine and started picking up rocks, hoping to find a diamond inside one of them and smashing them open. Actually, it turns out some of them are just rocks. And the exception to that was Bielsa, who was the finished, polished gem, wasn't he? And that's the one that they got right.
Although, some of the players they've signed have turned out to be good players. I think that's hard to deny, but not enough of them, and I think not enough of the players who big money was spent on, or what you class as big money, and Leeds United
And
terms.
if you're going to do that, Phil, you need to supplement it with, as Kinnear said, the 6 and 7s out of 10.
Well, there's the lesson, absolutely. But I think it was a combination of two things. I think it was a combination of what seems to me to be Orta's kind of preference or kind of the trend in his recruitment of going for things that seem a bit out there. Or I think you used the phrase Victor's broken toys, but that, why go for a really obvious coach when you could go for Jesse Marsh or. But also, as was apparent, and I think was apparent in the Kinnear interview, the financial limitations that meant that, when it came to it, they didn't have the quality that they needed.
One of the really interesting takeaways from it was when Angus said Leeds United breaks managers in reference to both Marsh and to Javi Gracia. And
I've said that to you loads of times on this.
But
it does.
It breaks players as well. I've said loads of times, it's a really heavy shirt to wear, is Leeds. And I don't know if it speaks to an arrogance or a hubris within the recruitment of managers and players that they didn't engage like this level of critical thinking with it, because you could have sat in a room and I could have told them that, because I've seen enough Leeds over the years to know that it does it. People just crumble for whatever reason under the demands of it, and I don't know if it's unique to our circumstances or our recent history has kind of damaged everybody, but we've seen these huge highs that have been offset with tremendous lows. I mean, like, who else has been in the Champions League and League One in the same decade? You know what I mean? It's
as
like,
the song goes, we're a right set of bastards when we lose.
Yeah, but you know what I mean? So it's kind of, we've done this bloody sawtooth trajectory, to use a Kinnearism, up and down through the leagues, and it's messed out a lot of our expectations up, because I mean, in my lifetime I've seen us lift the league title, and then 10 years later we were in the Champions League, and then 5 years after that we were in League One, and it's just... It blows your mind, and it creates a very unique mindset within the fans that gets passed down through the generations. And for whatever reason, it makes Ellen Road difficult to play in when things go badly. And too many players and too many managers have been recruited who just do not cut it.
I don't think it's unique entirely, because there are definitely other clubs that break managers too. I see it a lot with the Old Firm in Scotland, because being second in the SPL is the equivalent of, you might as well be in League One, and that is how it goes. If you're second in Glasgow, you're pretty much last, and the pressure's horrendous. Nobody lets you away with it. You're going to probably see it quite soon with Michael Beale. It's harsh, but people get sucked in because they think, amazing job, this great clubs to manage. Big footballing city, Glasgow. So you go do it.
There's a vanity, isn't there? Could I be the one? Could I be the one?
There's vanity, but there's probably also excitement as well, and just the lure of it, and then you get butchered. The difference at Leeds, I think, is that there must be occasions where coaches or managers and players have thought, okay, yeah, no, it's a championship club, and probably walk into it not quite realising what it's going to be like. There may well be this perception on the outside that although Leeds have really big tradition and culture and reputation and everything, they haven't done much for the last 20 odd years. So perhaps it's all just a bit kind of not easy, but perhaps there's not that much expectation. You get there, and the expectancy is always extreme. It is. It's always really wild, and justifiably so a lot of the time, I think. But also, there really are not many fan bases who kind of got flogged in the way that Leeds did from 2003 onwards. The catalogue of the book I wrote about Bielsa, the chapter in it about the demise, goes on forever, because there's just no end to it. The catalogue of failures and incompetence and things that didn't work, the promises that were made about this is going to happen, that's going to happen, never did. 15 years on, you're still in the EFL, you're still in the Championship, but finally, with that kind of big light at the end of the tunnel because of Bielsa, it does generate kind of irremovable frustration and anger.
Oh, we're very damaged as a fan base.
So I think somebody like Farke, for example, can probably withstand that, which is not to say that it's going to be a success for him, but I don't think you're going to see somebody who is going to fall apart on the touchline rapidly. Kinnear referenced the fact, as he put it, Farke has not lost his shit through this summer, which has been quite an achievement, because parts of this summer have been really difficult for him and haven't looked massively productive. The wait for signings, I guess the doubt about, we want Pirro, but are we actually going to get Pirro? Sinisterra still trying to get out the door at the very last hours of the transfer window. Said it loads of times, not an easy gig. But I think he is the sort of coach who is more able to cope with this sort of stuff. And you're right, you do have to pick right.
You might even describe it as what, Michael?
Unbelievable hard.
Unbelievable hard.
Indeed.
If only there was a mug with those words on it. Oh, there we go.
It was available for $9.99.
Oh, less than that.
Was it?
£8, I think.
£8.
Yeah. So
or free if you just come in here and nick one. Yeah.
Do you know what? Sold an absolute boatload of them, haven't we? Like, it's the fastest selling mug we've ever done. So if you want an unbelievable hard one, thesquareball.net. So, and cheers if you bought one as well.
You see mugs.
It just helps keep everything going, by the way.
We never sold any Jesse Marsh merch, did we?
No, we didn't.
Well, mugs with managers, head coaches on. Bielsa was an exception. I mean, you still sell, I would imagine, loads of Bielsa merch forever, no problem. But merch with head coaches on is risky because you just never know. And unlike players who have, like Jamie Shackleton, for example, rebirth this season, once you're gone, you're gone as a head coach, largely speaking.
Yeah. No, absolutely true. Absolutely true. Fans draw parallels between eras, though, don't they? And just to return to that subject and the reason why fans are like they are now, and I made this point too, Kinnear, as well, does the club understand that the frustrations and the over-the-top responses are often fueled by seeing parallels with what happened before, when we went down before? It's within a generation that we remember tumbling out of the Premier League and basically, Ridsdale, I don't know, hiding the fact that it was so bad, saying everything's all right, we'll sell this player and everything will be all right, and then we sell that player, and then we sell another one, and then we sell another one, and then we go down. It's like, and you just feel like year upon year upon generation, decade upon decade, you feel like you've been lied to.
You do. This is different in comparison to 2004. I've kind of always felt that, partly because of what I've been told about 2004. I mean, quite a lot of the stories from that period are disputed. Some people say X, some people say Y. Somebody told me that, as an example, when they got relegated from the Premier League, there were youth team players, and bear in mind this is like 20 years ago, there were youth team players who were a mile from the first team, never likely to play, a stack of them who were on 10 grand a week. That kind of, and if that's true, the addition to the wage bill alone is huge, and I don't think Leeds had anything in the way of relegation clauses, wage deductions, all that sort of stuff. They were in total financial meltdown at that point, which they just are not at the moment. It's not comparable. It's not to say that there aren't financial pressures in the Championship. There definitely are, and Kinnear spoke about P&S and the way in which, and this is probably the most relevant part of it actually, the way in which existing Championship clubs who've been here for a while and who have no parachute payments are becoming more and more intolerant of clubs coming down with additional money to spend, and are trying to, via limits on what you can spend and how much you can lose, are trying to make it more of a level playing field by saying, even if you come down with parachute payments of 55 million quid, 45 million quid, you aren't going to be able to spend that all on players because you'll breach P&S rules. But they are in, the squad isn't perfect. I found myself thinking this week, is a squad ever perfect? And the reason I was thinking that was because I noticed after the City game last weekend, our Manchester City writer Sam Lee tweeting, wanting some input for the podcast that he does, and saying to people, do you think City's squad is weaker this season than it was last season? Which is actually a fair question, because they've lost Gundogan and they've lost Mahrez, but there is part of you still that's thinking, it might
do the crown jewels? Do the crown jewels look as shiny this week?
Fractional degrees. Left back. There's a question mark over left back at Leeds, isn't there? I think if Byram is fit all the way through, he'll be a good one. But you have to wonder, is he going to be fit all the way through? And there's a question at number 10. And had they gone for a Mary and got a Mary done, then I think he would have played there, no problem. They didn't go for anybody else before the window closed, which I think tells you that the 49ers in particular, Farke presumably hadn't seen anybody else that he would have gone for, or that was available. But also, I think the 49ers were quite big this summer on trying as best they can, while accepting that they were going to have to do deals and there were going to have to be players coming in, not being drawn into signing players they didn't really want because they were feeling pressure to fill certain periods, certain positions. So it's not complete, but I think it's in a reasonably good place, pretty good place for the Championship. Whereas the squad that Kevin Blackwell had in 2004,
just him and Gary Kelly.
Gary Kelly, and I think Dubs might have been.
That's what he said at the time, wasn't it? It was just me and Gary Kelly was the famous mantra.
Yeah, that was pretty much it. Well, it wasn't really, but you saw where he was coming from. But that squad had very little chance. Admittedly, the summer after they did Hulse and they did Blake and they did Creswell, I think, Creswell Senior, and got into the playoffs, got to the playoff final. But I think this this squad and the structure of the club means that you shouldn't be looking at another collapse like that. Nothing like it.
As you say,
We'll get that clipped up in a couple of years' time.
Yes, in the conference. Yeah.
As you're saying at the start, Phil, like there's a willingness now, I think, from the club's part. They want to be able to draw a line under what's happened and taken us to this point. And, it's not necessarily in their gift to dictate when that happens,
No.
is it? And it's never just going to be a clean line, because there are certain people who've carried over between the eras, such as Angus Kinnear. But hopefully, if we can now build some momentum, get some wins on the board, the club just needs some wins, doesn't it? That's about the size of it, really.
He said it. The ultimate metric for football clubs is how are you performing, and it is, from a supporters' point of view, definitely.
One thing I wish we'd got into is next summer and the scenarios around that. Because obviously, if we go up, it's kind of fixed. We're out of there first time, everything's fine, at least until we're in a relegation battle again. But if we don't go up this year, what happens with all the players who are out on loan? What happens with the players who we've managed to hold on to this year?
Well, the loan clauses, I was just going to say, sorry to interrupt, I was going to say, I was in the car on the way home after we recorded it, and I went, shit, we forgot to ask about the loan clauses and what happens next summer. So I did reach out to the club and ask them, and the response is that obviously player contracts are confidential, so they can't discuss individual terms, but it's not going to be a problem next summer, is the way that they're viewing it. So
what does that mean, though?
I think it means that most of these clauses, the vast number of them, will not be an issue next summer. Will not be valid or not be present or whatever.
They were a
else.
one-shot deal. A one-shot deal, basically.
I think. I mean, someone suggested to me, again, I don't know if this is strictly accurate, but somebody suggested to me that Harrison's, for example, might be an issue again next summer if Leeds are not promoted and they're still in the Championship. As I say, I'm not sure if that is 100% right, but I think the number which they would have an issue with, if indeed they have any, would be very small in comparison to
be
this
good
summer.
fun if and when Luis Sinistera comes back, after what Kinnear said about that. It struck me that he wasn't very happy with the chosen method of exit, which, reading between the lines, was legal threats, because it's what we've been talking about in recent weeks, isn't it?
Yeah, you have to be a little bit careful with this, because none of us have seen the clauses. None of us have seen... We've been told on both fronts that Leeds felt that they weren't obliged to release Adams on the basis of what Bournemouth had bid for him, that they weren't obliged to release Sinistera on the basis of the offer that was made for him. Nice were particularly keen on Sinistera. I think Sinistera saw himself getting out on loan in the way that everybody else had before his clause expired. So Leeds' point of view was that legally they felt they were on a really strong footing, but they were concerned that if they were legaled by either Adams or Sinistera, it would be nigh on impossible to use them and to play them. It would be very, very difficult to involve them, potentially ever again. And also there's the risk that you might lose, so financially you end up in a hole, as they did with Jean-Kevin Augustin. Sinistera and Adams evidently felt that they were in the right, that they had a strong argument that they should have been allowed to go. And while I totally understand Leeds' frustration at the threat of legal action, you do have to accept that it is possible that the players had, that had this gone to the EFL, had it gone to CAS or whoever else, might have found in favour of the players, because Leeds felt with Jean-Kevin Augustin that they had a strong case. And it's hard to paint that as anything other than Augustin and Leipzig wiping the floor with them. But we'll probably never know. And I think the main thing is that in both cases it's kind of been sorted out. I don't see Sinistera coming back. Do you?
The one factor to think about this as well is if what happens with each respective side if they lose. If Sinistera loses his case, he's held to his contract. He probably has to pay the club's legal fees. If the club lose, you lose a £25 million footballer, which is obviously the stakes are different on both sides, aren't they?
And you also just do not need the hassle in them. I mean, Farke was not having Nonto and Sinistera training with the squad at any stage while the dispute was ongoing. It's quite intriguing that Farke thought it had been solved, and Farke thought it. And I suspect that in his head, the club had said to him, we've come to this point with it. I wonder if he genuinely thought Sinistera was going to stay. If he genuinely thought, actually, Lewis has decided that this is for me, I'll stick with it. I can imagine. I did ask Farke after the Sheffield Wednesday game, have any of these departures, I don't mean disappointed you because of the talent that you're losing, but have any of these departures disappointed you because of the way the players have handled themselves, or because of either your perception of their commitment versus what has actually happened? And he didn't get into that. He just said, look, it's kind of no point really. They've gone and that's kind of the end of it. But yeah, I just feel that if you get into a legal dispute with a player that they lose, having them in, unless you can completely wipe the slate clean and kind of refresh everything and agree to disagree and crack on, are they ever going to play for you again? Can you have them involved? I don't know. It becomes a complete mess. So I can totally see why people have annoyed on deadline day. At Sinisterra going when it looked like he would be staying. Jane Anthony, I think, is a good signing. Actually, I do think is a good signing for the Championship. Might in the end play more than Sinisterra anyway, depending on whether Sinisterra's fitness problems clear up. But I do think that getting into any form of legal dispute with either of these two would have been completely pointless when it came to trying to just have kind of like tunnel vision on the season ahead.
Yeah, I've said to a couple of mates who've discussed it with me, just like texted or whatever, that they didn't just burn their bridges on the way out, they properly napalmed them, didn't they? Which is probably a deliberate tactic because you want to make it impossible to go back, so the club is then forced into getting rid of you.
Well, it's irrelevant with Adams as far as the future's concerned because he's gone on a permanent basis, so he isn't coming back, and that's the end of that. Sinisterra, yes, potentially returning next summer when loan ends, particularly if Leeds have been promoted, but I think you kind of see with Nonto already that if player comes back in and plays pretty well, people tend to be quite forgiving. But it would be another scenario where you were needing that to happen because people won't forget this. They never do.
Overall, then, do you think it was a worthwhile exercise? Not from our point of view. It was good to get this stuff on record, but from the club's point of view.
Yeah, I think it was. As I said at the start of this, I think it's better to be seen to address these things, even if what you're hearing isn't what you want. It's better to address these things than not. Because as I say, if you want to engage with your fan base, you can't just engage constantly on your terms and when it suits. And I think there's been enough that's gone wrong in the past couple of seasons to justify somebody fronting up and saying, look, okay, hands up, this is what happened.
Worthwhile just to know how much Diego Llorente gets paid.
Yeah, I did do the calculations on that. He said it at the time because he said £6 million a year. And
I do wish we'd followed this up as well and said, surely if he's out of contract soon, isn't he? Oh no!
Yeah,
someone gave him a new one.
And again, this is one of the shortcomings of what we did is there was so much we had to cover and we had so many notes that I didn't even think about.
Oh no, absolutely! You
renewal.
couldn't have kept him here for 4 hours.
I didn't even think about Llorente's renewal, but when it came up and he said £6 million a year, I went, okay, fine, yeah, footballers earn millions of pounds a year in my head, and I thought, next thing, move on. And then when I was editing it, I went, I wonder how much that is a week. Oh, that's a lot of money a week. So I wonder if, given that there was an unwillingness to discuss the loan clauses because they're confidential within players' contracts, that actually that was just an exaggeration to make a point rather than giving us Diego Llorente's actual wage. I hope so anyway.
Again, it's the clash between what you are telling yourself and what the reality is, and the sort of the line we were given when Llorente did sign his new contract was that centre-backs are getting increasingly expensive, which is true. I think the sort of caveat to that is that good centre-backs are getting very expensive, and I don't think much of what we've seen of Llorente has convinced us at all that in certain leagues like the Premier League he's what you need. But they're just, okay, he's gone to Roma, he's a couple of loans out there, but Roma specifically didn't activate the option that they had on him, which I think was supposed to be for the fee that Leeds had signed him for. Taking him on loan again, I think probably high likelihood that he will go there permanently at some stage. But you've already seen with Rasmus Christensen that it doesn't seem to be going very well for him at Roma, which I don't think is coming as a huge surprise to...
I was going to say, do you know why that is, Phil?
No, fill me in.
It's because he's rubbish.
I mean, even however good Christensen is or isn't, I just don't see how last season is an advertisement for a club like Roma. It was a particularly peculiar signing, that one, I thought. But yeah, so with Llorente, you're saying to yourself, centre-backs are going up in value, so get him on a new contract, we can sell him for big money. The flaw in the plan being...
Is he not very good as well?
Well, it's not that good that people are piling in with huge offers in the way that they are with, say, Guardiola. Yeah,
but it brings you back to the idea that, there's a lot of underlying misjudgment in the recruitment. And, and I mentioned this to Kinnear as well, about bringing in these players from Austrian leagues and so on and so forth without any proven track record in the Premier League, putting them then on Premier League money, which can't be matched by anyone else in Europe, basically, and then finding yourself with a problem at the end. Especially when you've given him a 40 to a 60% wage reduction. But
send Brendan Aronson to Saudi Arabia. It's the only solution.
I think if ever an interview said that a club needed a fresh start, a totally new starting point, different personnel, different ideas, a different direction. That was it.
Yeah, definitely. Back next week then, Phil. We'll speak then. We'll see you in a bit.
The Square Ball Podcast.